From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. It's a snapshot of climate change in action. Plants and pollinators on the slopes of one of Colorado's most famous mountains are falling out of sync with one another. Researchers say rising temperatures and early snowmelt atop Pikes Peak are causing some noticeable shifts in the ecosystem and throwing off some important life cycles. Wildflowers on the mountain are blooming earlier, and pollinators like bees and butterflies are emerging at different times. And that's concerning because we rely on pollinators to make our crops grow. The researcher behind a new study says there are lots of these kinds of rhythms found in nature.
The greening of leaves on plants, hibernating animals, migrating animals, all the things that depend on these seasonal cues that are cued by things like temperature and snowmelt.
Julian Rizasco is an associate professor of ecology and biology at the University of Colorado Boulder. He wrote about this research last month in the journal American Naturalist. He joined me to talk about what the research team uncovered and whether there's any hope of slowing or reversing the trend. He told me his work began by looking at a study from a century ago that looked at flowers and bees on Pikes Peak.
The biggest thing that helped us in choosing this site was that a study was done there over 100 years ago by a famous ecologist named Frederick Clements and one of his students, Francis Long, where they studied the flowers and the pollinators on Pikes Peak to see who's interacting with whom. And they published a big study off of this that we were able to extract data from. We normally don't have long-term monitoring data as like what we would love to have, where we have data from every year where we know which flowers were blooming, when they were blooming, which pollinators were out there. Most ecological studies only last 1 or 2 years. But what we can do is with these historical studies is go back and repeat them to get a glimpse at how things are changing at the scale of a century.
Well, let's talk about the study and what you found. What did the landscape look like on the area of Pikes Peak that you studied, and what did you spend your time looking at?
So the landscape from the foothills up, the habitat hasn't been destroyed like it has in many places throughout the country and throughout the world over the last century. By having it maintained as natural habitat, we could use that to study the influences of climate change on plants, pollinators, and their interactions without the confounding effects of habitat destruction.
So you can kind of understand that it's climate change that's having this impact and not something else.
That's right.
Okay, and in part because of climate change, temperatures have been warming, snowpack melts more quickly than in the past. You and your team were looking for signs of kind of a mismatch in timing between plants and pollinators emerging. What did you find?
The first thing we wanted to do is document how the timing of these flowers and the pollinators is changing with climate change. So we expected with warming temperatures and less snowpack and faster melting snowpack that we would see these things happening earlier than they did, which is what we found. Over 2 weeks earlier on average for plants, about 10 days earlier for pollinators, with a lot of variation among different species.
So you found that both plants and insects are emerging earlier than usual. Couldn't this be harmless, like if they're still roughly in sync?
Yeah, and there's a lot of variation in terms of how different species respond. Some pairs of species might actually have more overlap than they used to, and some might have less than they used to. And then pollinators might also choose to visit different flowers. So there's sort of some reshuffling of the dance partners with changing of timing.
Okay.
Some of it might have positive effects for some populations of plants or pollinators, and some could have negative effects. So likely there's winners and losers as a result of these changes.
Plants and bees emerging at slightly different times sounds like a minor shift, a minor issue. Why are you concerned by these findings?
Because the worst is still ahead of us. So even though in the past century there might be some changes that are benign or beneficial. We could be getting to a point where these changes in phenological overlaps are having or have detrimental effects on populations and communities.
So it sounds like the concern among scientists is this is sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of what the impacts of climate change could be.
Yes.
Which species of plants and pollinators did you find are most impacted by this?
We see effects on the early side of the flowering season being most dramatic. And so, for example, there's some pollen wasps that specialize on penstemons that are showing up more than 2 weeks earlier than they used to. And then some early flowering penstemon species that, one of them showing up about a month earlier than it used to 100 years ago.
Whoa. It sounds like it really could impact not only plants that we enjoy looking at and growing in our yards, for example, but it could impact agriculture, crops.
That's right. Yeah. So wild pollinators are important for pollinations of our crops. They're also important for maintaining the biodiversity of many plants and natural ecosystems.
When I hear about studies like this, I wonder, what can people like me do in our own neighborhoods to help slow down or stop this trend?
Yeah, so in Pikes Peak, much like throughout Colorado, we have a lot of natural habitat that supports a lot of biodiversity. And so having these habitats that are wild and heterogeneous in places that have climate refuges, that's going to be the best bet for biodiversity to be able to weather the storm of the climate change that's to come. So we have a lot to be excited about in Colorado in terms of our wild areas. It's a hot spot for pollinator biodiversity. We have a great diversity of bees in the state, largely thanks to all this natural habitat that we have. And so preserving and maintaining and advocating for these natural areas that we have is really important. And then to curb the effects of climate change, we need to work to reduce emissions and try to mitigate the effects of the most severe climate change.
Julian Rizasco of CU Boulder studied how many plants and pollinating insects on Pikes Peak are emerging earlier in the spring than they did decades ago. We'll include a link to the study results in the show notes and at KUNC.org. Before we go, we received a thoughtful email in response to our episode about the search for Michelle Vanek, a hiker whose remains were found 20 years after she went missing. A listener named Jennifer told us she was one of the searchers who looked for Michelle in a snowstorm back in 2005. Jennifer wrote, "It was heartbreaking to not have any leads at the end of the day and see her father hang his head in anguish. My jaw dropped when I heard her remains had been located. This gives me closure, and I very much appreciated your coverage about it." Jennifer, thank you so much for sharing your experience. And if you have thoughts or questions about one of our episodes, send me an email, noco@kunc.org. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.